Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Spelunking Gone Wrong, submitted by G.I. Jack. In my mid-20s, I got into spelunking, that is, looking for rocks. I'd always been into collecting rocks, but when I say I got into it, I mean I was always looking for valuable stuff as I got older. I was just out of college and my dad had moved to Newport Richey in Florida after he and my mom split up. Looking for job prospects both in my home area, where my mom went, she lived in California, and in the South, I figured I'd spend some time with Dad. He was the one who told me that the town and county was pretty well known for their rocks and other gems one could find out there. In retrospect, I'm sure he was also using that as leverage for his own personal shit with my mom. But it was closer to where I lived, and I was going to spend the second half of summer out west anyway. Not knowing anyone in Newport Richey, I went online and searched for what was out there, and to my surprise, there were a number of places to find crystals, one of my favorites. My girlfriend and I had been talking about our future, but she was on an internship in Europe for the summer. We were pretty serious, and I thought about finding some good crystals and seeing about arranging and mounting them in a ring as a gift when she came back. Okay, before we go any further, yes, she did come back and we got married 2 years after this happened. She wasn't over in Europe getting her fuck on. One morning, I was looking for some open dig spots as opposed to the more touristy places you can go looking for stuff. I found an old quarry not too far from where my dad lived, so I looked it up on Google Maps, and it was a little off the main road. It also looked like there was some sort of building, so I got my stuff together, figured I'd stop near the building and get permission if I needed any to be out there. Always be polite if you're on unfamiliar ground, but in my case, politeness went out the window quick. When I got out there, I parked my F-150 at a barrier that was locked and followed a dirt and gravel road to the dig site, and saw the building was on the edge of where work had been done, but it didn't look like anyone had been out there for a long time. For good measure, I knocked on the door of the building, but no one was out there, and the windows looked like they were boarded up on the inside. I shrugged and went towards the dig site and began poking around. I found some good stuff right away and got lost in looking for all kinds of things: dolomite, crystals, lots of quartz, and even some fossils. I stopped for a drink of water and then suddenly got the feeling I was not alone out there. I was slapping a bristle brush on my pant leg while drinking some Gatorade, and I looked around the area. About 100 yards all around this dig site was forest. I didn't see anyone, but I did hear something moving off to my left, just in the trees. I listened more, but there was just the wind that was picking up. I had a pretty decent haul, and thought about leaving and looked up to see thunderheads moving my way. Still, I was so into what I was finding, I blew off everything. I found a few more pieces, and the thunderstorm came up quicker than I noticed. That's Florida for you. A flash of lightning and a loud boom of thunder had me moving quickly to the old building. I could have run to my truck, but I was also hoping it would be a quick storm and I could get back at things. So I ran to the little overhang at the front door of the building and decided to wait things out. As the rain came down, I was going through my finds, and that's when I heard a loud bang from inside the building, followed by a yell that was cut off. It actually made me jump, it was so startling and loud. I went to the door and also looked in the windows, but the coverings and years of dirt and grime made it impossible to see in, and of course there were the boards. I tried the doorknob. To my surprise, it opened. I stopped to think for a minute, finally using my brain. Was this a good idea? Then I heard another loud thump and another yell. Back to being an idiot. I turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open to a dusty room full of old construction signs and junk. I heard some shuffling from some rooms in the back, and again my rational brain said to get the hell out of there. Nah, my idiot brain was in control, and I creeped towards another door. There was a crack in between the door and the frame, and I leaned in for a closer look. It was darker in that room, but I could see two male figures standing there in front of a back door that was open. A third figure was on the floor, and as the two guys whispered, I only heard one snippet. "Kid's still out there." Then the person on the floor yelled out, and one of the other guys kicked the figure in the stomach. Then I noticed a really bad smell, like nothing I ever smelled before. The two guys picked up what turned out to be another guy who started begging for them to stop. He just kept saying, "No, no, no, come on, please, no, guys, no, no, no." They told him to shut the fuck up and dragged him over to what looked like a big metal dog crate, but with really small slats in it. I leaned forward a little bit more, and the smell was almost unbearable. And I watched as they threw this guy in the cage and shut and locked it. The guy was now screaming his head off, and one of the guys went out of view and came back with a huge snake, which he threw in the top hatch and slammed home and locked. The snake fell right on the guy, and he was screaming and screaming. I knew I had to get the hell going. Finally smart brain took over. I backed up as quiet as I could, went back to the door, and then started to make a run for my truck. Like a dipshit, I let the door slam behind me, but I didn't care, just booked it down the road. I got to my truck, started it, and looked up to see the two guys chasing after me. They looked out of their minds and were skinny as all hell with no shirts. They honestly looked like skeletons. I was whipping my head back and front, making sure to stay on the road while keeping an eye on these two maniacs, who I saw one was holding an axe. The other one had an axe handle. I popped over a berm onto the pavement without even looking for traffic, jammed it in drive, and tore out of there, actually going the wrong way from which I had come. I got my bearings and flew back to my dad's house and told him everything, and he said to call the cops. I thought about that on my drive home, but was so juiced up I just wanted to get as far away from those guys as possible. The sheriffs took my information and then called back and asked to meet me at the building and dig site. My dad thankfully got out of work and went with me, so I showed them where I was looking for my stuff and again told the whole story. I did notice there was a guy in the back seat of one of the cruisers. Another 2 units pulled up and went inside with hazmat suits and respirators. It was a meth lab that had been hastily cleared out, but the two guys chasing me had left the other guy in the cage with a huge Burmese python. It didn't hurt him, and I never heard what that was all about, but the mystery of what that place was being used for was cleared up. I guess their gimp didn't squeal on them, and after a few follow-up calls to me, I never heard another word about it. I ended up cutting my stay there short and went to California, where I now reside with a good job and my wife of 3 years. Every time my dad asks if I want to come back to visit, I say no thanks, let's meet someplace else. Shapeshifter on the Tracks, submitted by Kevin M. In the town I grew up in Vermont, there were some train tracks that ran behind my house that I used to get around to my friends' houses, and we would fool around a lot out there because they were abandoned. Fireworks, campfires, the occasional beer and weed parties, you name it. We did it out there and no one really cared. Our parents probably knew what we were up to out there, but we rarely told them about our hijinks, just that we walked up and down them as a shortcut. One night, I was hanging at my friend Kevin's house playing Super Mario 2 with another friend, Sean. It was getting late and I had to go home. My parents were cool, but they wanted me home by midnight to go to church the next morning. Sean and I left Kevin's and cut through his yard to get to the tracks that would lead us back to our houses, about a mile away. The moon was out and it illuminated the tracks with a cool but eerie glow. We were just walking along, talking about shit teenagers talk about, girls mostly. After a minute or two, Sean looked ahead in the moonlight and said, "Dude, bear." I also looked up and saw a fairly large black bear that had just come out of the woods about 50 yards in front of us. We both stopped and watched it as it went over the tracks, stopping for a minute to sniff the air, and then terrifyingly look over at us. It had to have been a minute while it stared at us, but then it wandered back into the forest on the other side of the tracks. We gave it about 5 more minutes and then started walking at a quicker pace. And we saw bears all the time out there, but we were still wary. Most of the time, they don't bother anyone, but they are still wild animals, and you just never know. As we got to the spot where it had crossed the tracks, We looked side to side but saw nothing and breathed a sigh of relief. Just as we passed it, there was another noise from behind the woods where the bear went. Like morons, we stopped and listened to the rustling. As we stood there, the branches parted and this strange-looking guy came out and walked up on the tracks. He was tall and heavyset with long hair and a really thick beard. We'd never seen him before, and I grabbed Sean's arm as if to say, "Let's get the hell out of here." The guy stood there and then just said in a deep voice,
"Careful, there's bears out tonight."
And then he kept looking at us like we were supposed to respond. I said something like, "Yeah, thanks. We saw one just a minute ago." The guy took one step forward and leaned toward us, and then asked,
"Want to see another one?"
And he gave off this really messed up grin, and I could see that his teeth were not human. I mean, at least that's what it looked like. He had huge incisors, longer than normal human teeth. That was it. I turned and started hauling tail away from the guy. Sean followed, and after 100 yards or so, I looked over my shoulder, and I saw something crazy. The guy was gone, but in his place was a black bear standing on its hind legs. I mean, I kid you not, it had only been maybe 15 seconds or so. The guy was gone, and there was the bear. We didn't stop. We just kept running as fast as we could, and then jammed into the woods behind Sean's house and onto his back lawn. I lived across the street and just bolted on home. But later that night, Sean called me, and I got up before my parents. I had an extension in my room. He said he was looking out his bedroom window and saw the strange guy standing in his yard looking up at him. It was summertime, and Sean had screens in the windows, and he said the guy said,
"Yep, lots of bears out tonight."
And that's when Sean grabbed the phone and called me. While he was on the phone with me, he went back to the window, but the guy was gone. The next morning, he went out to the spot with his dad, who was out there fixing a piece of fence, and said, "Man, look at these tracks." It's right where the guy had been standing. There were huge bear prints in the wet grass. That was one biggie, Sean's dad said. Sean didn't say anything other than, "Yeah, I guess." We never saw that guy again, but the bears are still out there. I wonder if one of them is a shapeshifter and was giving us a warning to stay off the tracks or out of the woods at certain times. We're all grown up now, and I guess we'll never know. Could have gotten a degree in criminology by Mysterious Armoire. At the time of this story, I was 21 and living in a major Midwestern city, attending university there. Having lived there for only 1 month before my story began, I had witnessed a train stop stabbing, been yelled at by a crackhead, and had a homeless guy follow me and threaten to choke me out outside the physics building on campus. I also watched a 13-car cop raid on a drug house just across the street. The area around the university is known for being rough and has a notoriously high rate of crime. We would get a few texts a week from the campus police saying things like there had been a robbery, a break-in, an assault, stalkings, attempted kidnappings, etc. I always ignored these texts, thinking foolishly that I would never be a victim because I was smart enough to stay out of trouble. To not go out alone late at night, all the cliches. I seriously regret this behavior now, and to anyone listening to this, please never think that you're 100% safe, no matter your level of preparedness. Always do your best to stay observant and careful. The first incident wasn't too unusual. I was just a block or two from my apartment building one day in the early evening. It was still light outside, and I was walking my dog Sesame, a cute Shiba Inu who looks just like a fluffy, goofy puppy, and has never been frightening or particularly protective in his life. As I was heading back home, I passed a small parking lot, and in it a large van. I could see a man in his early 60s sitting in the driver's seat smoking a cigarette. He was staring at me. As I passed, he actually leaned out of his car and called out to me, "Hey, you there, that's a cute dog, what's his name?" I should mention this isn't even my first story like this. I have a pretty intense fear of strangers and actually struggle with PTSD from other incidents in my life. being pretty wary for this reason, I ignored him and just walked faster. I heard a car door shut behind me and turned quickly to see that he had gotten out of his van and was slowly walking toward me. He called out to me again, "Hey, baby, I just want to see your dog. Come back." His phrasing pissed me off, and I gripped my dog's leash and started to speed walk away from him, starting to feel nervous. My heart was beginning to pound, but I just kept telling myself over and over that I was overreacting, and it was just my paranoia acting up, and there was nothing to worry about. Boy, was I wrong. I managed to turn the corner and was about to cross the final park before getting to my apartment. In my fear over the van guy, I wasn't paying attention as much as I usually do to what was in front of me. I looked back over my shoulder, and the guy had stopped following me. He was, however, standing in the middle of the sidewalk with a huge, creepy grin on his face. I whirled back around with my eyes glued to my building, and I only needed to walk another half a block and I'd be home. I was just trying to get away from him and his creepy van. And just when I thought I was safe, a group of 5 or 6 men came from the side of the park I wasn't watching. They were all tall and intimidating in stature, and all of them were laughing and looking right at me. Out of the corner of my eye, the van guy had started walking towards me as well. I remembered that he was whistling. I again picked up my pace and desperately searched for my keys in my pocket as I hurried to the door. The group of men then veered towards me, partially cutting me off, and in all my stupid politeness, I stopped. They grinned at me with sick, perverted smiles, obviously checking me out, looking up and down my body. It made me sick. I tried not to panic and inched closer to my apartment. "Hey, what's your name? Where are you going? What's your Snapchat? Is that your apartment? Can we come over? Do you smoke?" They all barraged me with questions, one after another. I tried to refuse them, stammering, "No, thank you," as I saw the van guy come and join their group, leering at me. When I inched away, they inched closer, and one of them reached out for me, his fingers actually touching my arm. I leapt back, trying not to start crying, but Sesame suddenly lunged at them, his teeth bared, a horrifying snarl ripping from his throat. Every bit of cute Shiba Inu personality was gone, and he looked like he wanted to tear one of these guys' throats out. It startled them enough that I was able to turn and sprint the final distance to my building, locking the door behind me. I fell to the floor inside my building, hugging Sesame. However, the entire front of my building was glass, and to my horror and disbelief, the group of men came and stood in front of the windows, grinning at me, laughing and making kissy faces and lewd gestures. The apartment manager came out and called the cops on them, but they ran away. I made it back to my place and scrubbed myself in the shower, crying and shaking with fear. Sesame got a special dinner that evening, and I kept telling myself that they just wanted to mess with me, and I was never in any real danger. Stupid of me. I know now. About a month later, when I had finally managed to be able to walk outside my apartment without severe anxiety, I was actually planning on moving a bit farther away from campus. It was still going to be in a sketchy neighborhood, but the thought of those men knowing where I lived kept me up at night. My apartment actually hired a security guard to be there 24/7 after someone had broken into the building, smashed all the windows, destroyed some furniture, and stole a bunch of bikes. Of course, my bike got stolen. Anyway, I was heading home from class, and it was a beautiful day. I actually felt pretty happy for once and popped my earbuds in on the last few blocks before I got home. Stupid, I know. After a block or so, I started to feel like someone was watching me. My palms started sweating. I glanced behind me, trying not to look obvious, and a tall man was about 20 feet behind me, staring straight at me. I snapped my head back around and ripped out my earbuds. No, I thought. It can't be one of them. I was just jumping to conclusions, giving my anxiety disorder and paranoia, surely. But there was something familiar about him. My heart started racing as I hoped to God the others weren't waiting for me around the corner of my building ready to jump me. I walked faster, wishing Sesame was with me. I was too afraid to look back at this guy as I fumbled with my keys and wrenched the door open as hard as I could. This turned out to be a crucial mistake. As I ran to the elevator trying to breathe a sigh of relief, I saw with absolute horror that the man had caught the door I had thrown wide open, and he was slowly coming into the building with me. He paused, standing away from me, but close enough that I could hear his ragged breathing and smell alcohol coming off him. My heart was thudding in my chest now, and I struggled to think clearly. The apartment manager was already home for the day, and I was completely alone in the lobby. There were no other doors out of that room, and the stranger was blocking my way to the door. The security guard supposed to be keeping an eye on the building was nowhere to be seen either. The elevator came, and I tried to run into it and slam my hand over the closed door button as fast as I could. I pushed my floor button and huddled in the far corner of the elevator. I started to once again try to catch my breath, but right when the door was almost closed, he stuck his hand in. I couldn't believe it. He waited until the door was just about to close, and then he stopped it. He was standing close enough that there was no way this was a mistake. My stomach dropped, and a suffocating sense of dread crept in. I kept my head down as he joined me. My desperate hope was that he was just a dirty, drunken resident of the building, but that was dashed when he didn't press any buttons. I don't know why I didn't run out of the elevator or try to leave the building again. I was paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was watch as the door closed and sealed my fate. The elevator was filled with the stench of alcohol and BO. If I wasn't so terrified, I may have gagged. It was nauseating. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't move. I tried to scream at myself in my head to press the wrong button and try to escape him, but I was completely petrified. He leaned closer to me, and I heard him breathe in deeply and very quietly sigh like he was content. I felt tears well in my eyes, and the seconds it took to reach the top floor where I lived felt like hours. I saw no way I could escape the sick drunk guy who was smelling me. In the reflection of the elevator walls, I could make out his disgusting smile. He was staring directly at me, his hands in his pockets, clearly holding on to something. I'm not religious, but I prayed that I would make it to my door in time. I realized he probably wasn't going to attack me in the elevator. There was a large camera in the ceiling. I looked up at it, feeling a tear spill out of my eye as I did so, hoping that whoever saw the tape eventually would identify this man. The worst part of all this is that I've trained in martial arts and self-defense since I was about 8 years old. I thought of myself as stronger and braver than I was acting. I should know what to do. I should be strong enough to do it, but no matter how many times I had disarmed, thrown, or choked out attackers in the studio, nothing totally prepares you for the dread of a real-life situation. As the elevator reached my floor, I managed to snap out of my stupor long enough to dash through the door and run to my apartment unit. I nearly missed the keyhole, but I threw open my door, and I was nearly through when my backpack snagged on the outside handle of the door, trapping me. I heard the man walking quickly to my door, a low chuckle building in his throat as he watched me panic and struggle to get free. I felt like a mouse being watched by a cat, trapped and helpless, so close to escaping. I finally gave up and shoved my arms through the straps, abandoning my backpack. As I did so, the man suddenly reached out for me. I was able to slam the door shut, deadbolting it. A gust of hot air from the door slamming brought his disgusting smell in with me, and in my terror and disgust, I retched violently. I looked through the peephole. He was staring right at me, pressing his forehead against the door, his mouth bent in a furious scowl. He swore at me, ripped my backpack off the handle of the door, slamming it to the ground, and I winced as I heard my laptop thud. I was still too terrified to say anything, but I grabbed the knife I kept by my door in my hand, ready if he tried anything. After a few minutes of staring at my door, jiggling the handle, licking the peephole, and making obscene motions at it, he unzipped my backpack, dumping its contents on the floor. He picked up my bag, sniffing it, and leered at the peephole as he did so, like he knew I was watching him. I couldn't look away, and again, paralyzed in fear. Finally he left, using the elevator visible from my door like nothing had happened. I continued to stare out of the peephole for what felt like an eternity, and then finally called the apartment manager, feeling my anger sinking in, that the security guard hadn't been anywhere in sight, totally not paying attention. It turns out he had fallen asleep eating Taco Bell and was watching movies on his phone. He was only 10 feet away from the elevator the entire time, sleeping in the office behind a closed door. They fired him, but the creepy guy was never caught, and neither were any of the others. I don't even know for sure if this man was part of the original group. I was honestly too terrified to look much at their faces during the first incident. I moved out of my apartment a week later, staying with my boyfriend at the time for the remainder of my lease, and keeping Sesame with me at all times when possible. A few more things happened while I lived in that city, from having to call in a gunfight from outside my new apartment window, to having to pick up my friend who was being followed by a van, to having to evacuate during an arson incident. There are nice things to say about that city too, but during my time there, besides learning the police department was absolutely useless and corrupt, to nearly escaping with my life multiple times, I couldn't be happier to be far, far away from there, and doing a lot better with my fear and anxiety. Danger on the Trail, submitted by Polk. This just happened a couple of weeks ago when I was hiking in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. I was hitting a couple of the shorter trails as a way to kill a weekend and get my head around a number of things I was dealing with. Most of the trails were heavily trafficked during the day and are actually very scenic. On my last trail hike, I decided to go on one that was about 8 miles out and back. It was a little later in the day and I was planning on finishing it, getting something to eat in town and then crashing one more night before driving back to Albany the next morning. When I got to the trailhead parking lot, I noticed that I was the only one there, which is kind of odd for the Adirondacks in the summer, but I did chalk it up to being late on a Sunday. Anyway, I didn't care. I was going to make the most of my hike, so I set off with my pack and stopped a few times to take some pictures. There's a waterfall on this trail, but the recent lack of rain had it just a trickle, but it was still cool and I was really enjoying myself. The next part of the trail was a heavily wooded portion, and I'd done this trail with some friends in the past and remember how dark it got as soon as you go into the trees. This part of the trail lasted for a couple of miles before it dumped you out onto a gorgeous lake that was a little more open. I was actually toying with jumping in the water as it was very hot out. I guess I was kind of in my head and not really paying attention. But then, off to the side and a little in front of me, I heard a female's voice call out for help. I stopped and looked around but didn't see anything and called back, "Are you okay?" There was nothing in response, and I didn't hear anything else. Straying from the trail at this point would have been serious bushwhacking through trees and undergrowth, so I figured I would just keep moving on, and if someone was in need, they probably were on the trail ahead of me. I walked for another 5 minutes or so, and then heard the same female voice calling for help. It sounded like it was a little closer, so again I yelled out, "Hi, is everything okay? Are you all right?" Just then, from around a bend, out came a guy who looked really sweaty and discombobulated. He said, "Hey man, you gotta help me, my girlfriend's in serious trouble. I think she broke her ankle." I stopped and looked at him and gave him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, he was dressed for a hike and wasn't just some scumbag wandering around the trails like you hear in so many of the other stories online. But still, something seemed a little odd. I mean, why would he leave his girlfriend and actually walk back this way on the trail, which was a lot longer to get back to the trailhead? If he had gone towards the lake, it was a much shorter jaunt back to vehicles and the road. But I was in a giving mood and said, "Okay, where is she? Is she on the trail?" He looked at me for a second and then shook his head and said, "No, she's off the path. She wanted to get some flowers that were inside the trees that she saw." Right, now my spidey sense was going off. I'm sure there are flowers out there, but this whole thing seemed a little odd. I mean, why hadn't he gone with her? Why did she go alone? I said, "Okay, let's go see what we can see," but I was still on high alert. We got to a dip in the trail and he kind of pointed off into the trees. I hadn't heard her calling for help anymore, but at this point it also dawned on me, why would she be calling for help if she was out here with her boyfriend? Again, red flags. He pointed and said, "She's in just a little ways. I can get some big sticks to act as crutches, and if you can go in and see what kind of shape she's in, that'd be great." Okay, now my bullshit meter was off the charts. There was no way I was going in there. I told him I would look for the sticks and he could go and get his girlfriend. He reluctantly went into the brush and I decided I was getting the hell out of there. I started hiking very fast towards the lake, I mean, oftentimes people camp there, and I was hoping there would be some folks enjoying themselves, and that would take away my fear knowing that there were other people out there. I heard some noise behind me, and I turned to see the guy, this scraggly-looking woman, and another guy coming back onto the trail looking up and down, and finally spotting me. They started running towards me, and I said, "F it," and started running towards the lake. My mind was going crazy, and all I could hope for was that there were people down there. I was in much better shape than any of those people chasing me, and I easily outdistanced them. Got to the precipice where the trail headed down towards the lake, and I didn't stop running even though I was at one point about to lose my balance. That was probably the scariest point for me, knowing that if I fell, these three weirdos probably would have caught up to me pretty quick. I kept running, and I saw that there were a number of tents pitched right near the lake. I didn't see anybody out there and figured they were probably hiking someplace else or whatever, even when I called out. I mean, no one responded. I turned around and saw the three people standing at the top of the little hill, knowing that they were probably not coming down into an area where other people might be. I flipped them off and continued to run to the other side of the lake and up the trail, knowing that the trailhead parking lot was only about a mile away at that point. I got there, jumped into my Jeep, and sped out of there without looking back. There were still no cars in the trailhead parking lot. I mean, I suppose that those people could have been some of the folks camping out by the lake, but that seemed kind of a stretch. I have no idea what they would have done to me had I fallen for their ruse. I was just happy to be on my way, and skipped dinner and drove all the way home that night just for good measure. It sucks that there's jerks out on the trails that ruin a wonderful time with creepiness. And hopefully I'll never run into them again. House Visit from Black-Eyed Children, submitted by Carly. When I was 19 years old, my mom's friend asked me if I would be interested in making $300 to house sit for a weekend. And this was in 1988. Minimum wage was like $3.15 an hour. So how could I say no to feeding 2 cats, watching TV, and swimming in a pool for that kind of money? Sue, the homeowner, said I could have one friend stay overnight with me, but no parties and blah blah blah. I had just broken up with my boyfriend, and I was kind of into just having a girls' night in. So we snuck in 6 or 7 bottles of wine and just planned on getting a little saucy and complaining about men. Friday evening came, we had dinner, and out came the wine as we played MTV. You remember actual music videos, kids? We just sat around commiserating. Before we got too loaded, we went for a swim under the stars and ended up laughing more than bitching. We dried off, got out some crackers and cheese, and went back to the living room for more music and chat. We did get a little soused by the time 2 a.m. rolled around, and then we decided to go to sleep, or rather fall asleep on couches with the TV still going. Around 3, I thought I heard someone or something on the front porch, and I woke up. I saw that the cats were inside and awake, getting ready for the 3 a.m. spaz out cats seem to love doing. I got up quietly and checked the front door and looked out onto the porch. There was nothing there, so I just blew it off, got a glass of water, and then snuggled back under my blanket on my couch. The next morning we woke up not hungover at all and decided to do some shopping after making sure the cats were taken care of. We wandered around the mall for most of the day, and for those of you old enough, think merry-go-round, the Gap, and of course Spencer's Gifts for a few laughs. Karen and I are still friends, and we still laugh about fundies, the underwear for couples. We picked up some things for dinner, and when we got back to the house, I mentioned the noise on the porch. Karen hadn't heard it, and I had forgotten about it, so no big deal. We made dinner and then prank called her boyfriend a few times just for a laugh as we cracked back into the vino. Her boyfriend took in the call in stride and told us to knock it off. A little later, maybe around 11, we both heard a knock on the front door. We looked at one another, but I figured it was just a neighbor. So I went to the door, opened it, and on the other side of the storm door, glass from top to bottom, I saw a little boy standing there. He looked a little odd and was wearing an awkward-looking gray suit. His head was down, and he said in a tiny voice, "Hi, can you help me? I don't know where I am." I looked back at Karen, and she got up to join me. She heard the voice, too. Karen said maybe he just needs to use the phone, but something about this child seemed off. It seemed wrong. "Where are you supposed to be, kiddo?" I asked through the glass. He just stood there for a moment and replied, "I'm supposed to be with my mother, but I think she's at home. Can I come in and use your phone to call her so she can come get me?" I just stood there feeling uneasy. Like I said, something was wrong about this. I could feel it. I said something about the phone not working, and he mumbled that he saw us using the phone earlier. I mean, how long had this kid been out on the porch watching us? This was getting creepier by the minute. "Well, it's broken now. I'm sorry," I said. And that's when he raised his head up at me, and I saw that his eyes were black and shiny. No pupils, just big black eyes. I completely froze like I was in a trance. "Please let me in. I just need to call my mother." His voice had changed and got a little deeper as he stared at me. I tried shaking my head but couldn't break his gaze. I mean, those black eyes just peered right through me, it seemed. "Please let me in now. Let me in." Karen, who was behind me and not looking right at him, started to pull me away from the door, but it was like my feet were glued to the floor. "Let me in. Please, let me in," he said one more time before Karen pulled my hair and the trance was broken. I stepped back and Karen shut the door. I just shook my head and looked at her wide-eyed and asked, "What the hell is going on?" Just then it started raining. A pretty good storm was on the way. There was a slow, methodical knocking on the door, and I could still hear his voice begging to come in. Just then there was a knock at the back door. There was no back porch out there. It was just an overhang. Karen turned and ran to it, and I heard her scream. I jumped a little and followed her, and at the back door was a little girl about the same size as the boy, also wearing a weird gray dress. Her head was up, and she had the same black eyes like spilled oil. "Is my brother in there? We need to find our mother. Please let me in." Now Karen was frozen, and I was normal, totally freaking out. I pulled Karen away, and that's when I noticed that the wind was really blowing the rain around, but this little girl stayed bone dry. She wasn't getting soaked like everything else in the yard. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Karen snapped out of it, and that's when we heard both voices. They sounded like they were inside the house, and louder this time, saying, "Please let us in now. We need our mother." It kept repeating, getting louder and louder, and then there was a loud crack of thunder and lightning, and we both screamed. The voices stopped. The storm was now really going wild, and we were more than scared. Karen ran to the phone and called her boyfriend. He was a big guy, played Division I football, and we needed him now. She was barely coherent, yelling for him to come over and help us, and being the good guy that he was, he said he was on his way. We sat on the couch holding on to one another, now crying, and one last time we heard, "Please, let us in." We saw car lights in the driveway and then heard footsteps on the porch. I got up and ripped the door open, and Karen's boyfriend Teddy came in and asked what the hell was going on. We talked over each other trying to get the story out, and he took a look at the 2 half-drained bottles of wine and cocked his eyebrows at us. "I think maybe you 2 ladies have had a little too much wine," he said, smiling. And then a final time there was the voices. "Please, let us in." Teddy's head snapped up and he ran for the back door. There was another flash of lightning, and the thunder felt like it was right outside as the windows rattled and the whole house shook. We ran to him and practically jumped on him. We all crashed to the floor and just sat there waiting for the storm to blow over. After a few minutes it did, and we all slowly got up. Teddy went to the door and did what we didn't think to do. He turned down the floodlights in the backyard, and his mouth dropped open. Karen and I looked to where he was looking, and we all looked out across the yard together. Heading away from the house were 2 sets of little footprints in the wet grass that went all the way to the edge of the property and ended at the taller grass of a field that bordered the house. They stopped right there. Teddy shook his head and closed the door and relocked it. He then ran to the front and made sure that that door was locked too, and we begged him to stay even though that was breaking the house rules. We didn't want to be alone there, just us girls. He said he'd stay, but promised he'd leave early enough in the morning so we wouldn't get into trouble. We all poured more wine and got our nerves settled, and nothing else happened for the rest of the night. The next day, I went to the back window, but the little footprints were gone. I asked aloud if we were all suffering from some kind of group hallucination, but we all know what we had heard and seen. After cleaning up the house, we all went back to our houses after tending to the cats, and I never mentioned anything to the homeowner. I didn't really tell anyone. I was certain no one would have believed us, and certainly would have done the same thing Teddy did concerning the wine. It wasn't until much later in life I heard about the black-eyed children on Art Bell's radio show, and actually called in to tell the tale. No offense, Uncle Jay. Most people don't believe they're real, but Karen and I are convinced, and to this day we talk about it, and remember it like it was yesterday. I mean, what do they really want? As much as I'd like to know, I'm glad we didn't fall for their hypnotic stuff and find out that night. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a scary story of any nature that you would like to have narrated on this channel, email unclejosh truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, click the little bell for notifications every time I upload, and of course follow me on social media. Links to that are all in the description below. Lots more to come. Thanks everybody for sticking around. Until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.